Everyone, I'd like to call the study session of the University City Council to order at 5:30 on January 27th. We've got a relatively light agenda for the meeting itself. Hearing none, I will turn it over to Councilmember Carr, who, by the way, for city clerk purposes, we do need to get the names of all of the participants who are here tonight, so we have that for the record.
Mayor, would you like to do that first?
If each of you could grab a microphone as we go around the table, then Laurette will have it for our record recording purposes.
Bobette Patton.
Go ahead.
Steve McMahon.
Mark Holly.
Gary Ehrenberg.
Todd Thompson.
Bob Chris.
Eric Stein.
John Tiemann.
Good evening. I am very proud to present the work product and the long summary long-awaited summary from the Stormwater Task Force. This task force was formed about 2 years ago, and they, the members have been hard at work. I won't steal their thunder by talking about it, but these are among the hardest working people in University City, and I'm very, very proud to introduce the chairperson, Dr. John Tiemann. Thank you.
Okay. Mayor Crow, honorable members of the City Council, and to the civil servants of University City, as well as my fellow citizens. With Resolution 2017-10, the Stormwater Task Force was established on the 26th of June in 2017. The appointed members are engineers and scientists, as well as concerned citizens. Many are motivated by professional dedication, while others are motivated by the fact that they are personally impacted by stormwater. And I hasten to add that those are not mutually exclusive categories. Next slide, please. This is Wilson Avenue. Throughout the metropolitan area, Sunday the 14th of September in 2008 was a bad day. After ravaging Florida and Texas, the remnants of Hurricane Ike came to our town. Depending on where you were in St. Louis, between 3 and 5.5 inches of rain fell in less than 6 hours in the early morning. If 5.5 inches in 6 hours doesn't sound like much, consider that the folks who only experienced inches of rain before that were now facing 8 to 10 feet of water. That flow could be about 10 miles per hour, about 15 feet per second. The volume and the speed are such that, put simply, no one can withstand or outrun a flood like that. Overall, flooding damaged 350 homes in University City, of which the city condemned 275. On Wilson Avenue, everyone suffered. About half the homes were damaged beyond repair. 2 of our neighbors drowned. Louise Bryant, who was 64, and her companion, Willie Johnson, 81, died when the floodwaters swept them away. Pictured here are the kinds of problems on Wilson Avenue that compelled the council to establish the Stormwater Task Force. We have now completed 2 years of study, which we are now officially presenting to you. I might add that probably all of you are familiar with this, that bottom right is where the houses used to be. And that's also where Louise Bryant and Willie Johnson died. Next slide, please. Stormwater is, while not always as dramatic on Wilson Avenue, is not a rare problem in University City. Indeed, it's a rather common problem. For some, it's an everyday problem. Here are just a sampling of the kinds of problems many of our fellow citizens face. The River Des Peres banks are continually eroding and affecting homes. Shown here on the left is a home near Hanley and Shaftesbury. Creek erosion will cause the loss of that air conditioner compressor there in the next few hours. The home will be lost sometime in the next 15 years. The picture on the right is a site on Shaftesbury across from the natatorium. The homeowner has had to build that bank stabilization at her own expense. Next slide, please. Some of the problems are far uphill from the River Des Peres. Pictured here is a yard flooded near Lewis Park. It should be noted that this picture is from the public side of the fence, but the person's yard on the other side of the fence looks just like this. I would now like to turn over the talk to my colleague, Mark Holly.
Thank you. This is just a diagram showing the watershed in our area. So you can kind of see the boundaries around that constitute the River Des Peres watershed with the Inglehome Creek down there. And of course, we're all kind of familiar with this being kind of the hot spot there in our municipality. So we started in mid-2017. At that point in time, the only data that we really had that was hard data was data that was collected by MSD from complaints that they had. That was collected from 1994 all the way through 2017, and we had around 900 complaints on there. It turned out when we looked at that in greater detail, by the time they had collected all that, some households had gone back to the trough several times to get things corrected. So when we were just looking at households, that got down to about 600. And then, but that data was very limited. First off, it wasn't contemporary. It was collected over the last 23 years. And then it wasn't very descriptive. MSD's description of the problem was sewer overcharge on all of them. So you really didn't have a sense of what kinds of problems were showing up in those households. So in the latter part of 2017, the task force decided to develop a survey. This is a copy of the questions there, and they dealt with standing water, flooding and rushing water, erosion, as we said, and actual water entry into the houses. So that survey was developed, and actually a link was noted in ROARS in February of 2018. And through February of 2018 through May, we got less than 100 surveys. So at that point in time, although that was good data, we felt that we needed a little more and got ROARS to put a full-blown insert into its thing, since it went to every residence. And along with that, it also had the link that was there before, which was an electronic link to the survey. And through that, we boosted the number of responses to about a little over 300. And so by the end of, we kind of cut off at February of 2019, last year, and started taking a look at the data in detail. So we had both physical surveys and the electronic surveys that were put in and combined those together. In addition, we had a few where people didn't identify themselves, and in some cases that was because it was use of very colorful language on some of those returns. So you know, in the end, we had a little over 300 responses. Of those, about a third of those were paper responses. So, in addition to getting the statistics on how many of what kinds of problems that we had, we felt it was kind of important to actually see what was going on and see where households are located, look for clumps in the data, as it were, and things. This was all loaded into a Google Earth map. So if you wanted to zoom up, like it looks pretty clumpy around right here. Why are all those responses coming from there? You could scale up on there, and in some cases you would find that although the indicator looks like one household, when you scaled it up, there might be 6 households in a very tight band there. And so we looked at that and were able to kind of see what kind of clusters we're doing. So if you go back to all of the responses from MSD, plus the ones that we had that said, and subtracted out the ones that said they reported to MSD previously, you can probably say that we have about data on about 800 households that have had some sort of water problem in the past. So with the summary of data, we had, there were a couple of things I'd like to highlight. So, say for instance, flooding, that description on the chart is relatively benign, but when we had the actual question in the survey, it said, you know, flash flooding or intense high-speed gushes of water. So then you see some of those things that can sweep people away if they wade out into them, particularly in murky water where they don't know what's underneath sometimes. The other thing in terms of basement flooding, 152 indications of having basement flooding. Of that, 88 of those occur on multiple times a year. So it's not something that happens once and then you get it kind of cleaned up and 5 years later, you know, you might have another problem. But some of the folks are dealing with this every 3, 4 months. And so we think that those are areas to kind of concentrate on. So again, we were able to also put this kind of data into a map so that you could see the different problems, colorize the markers so that you could see gradients of problems occurring, and so on. So I think with that, I will introduce over here, Eric Stein.
So we started looking at these kind of problems because we were concerned about what the effect might be on flooding. And this is just one example of what we found. Other examples might be over on Ingleholm Creek at Kingsland, for instance. There's 3 12-foot culverts going under the roadway at that point, and 2 of them are 2/3 full of sediment. The Groby Street Bridge won't even pass a 2-year flood. We had a 2-year flood last July 22nd, and the water was way over the bridge deck and cars were floating. The Pennsylvania Bridge over by the dog park was not quite that bad, but there was water all the way up on the I-beams approaching the deck, along with quite a bit of sediment under the bridge. And that's only a quarter mile from the tunnel. We think these are problems. They're no doubt contributing to flooding. We need further study needs to be made of this and the responsible parties identified. Flash flood warning is not only feasible, it's feasible at low capital investment. And that's because the heavy lifting's already been done. We're very fortunate that we had some historical data in this watershed. MSD, we found out, operates a network of rain gauges in conjunction with Project Clear in our basin. And they were kind enough to give us login privileges so we could monitor those gauges over the last couple of years. In addition, there's a USGS stream gauge located at the Purdue Bridge in Heman Park. Put those two things together and you've got the historical data you need to design a flood prediction algorithm. And that's not easily done, but that has been done for us, courtesy of Professor Bob Chris here from WashU. So the heavy lifting's all been done. There are some lots of logistical details about methods of warning and so forth. Technically, surprisingly, we're looking at somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000 for a network of 3 to 4 fully automated telemetering range gauges and the software we need to process that data to do flood prediction. The three of us here, Professor Chris and Gary and myself, are on the flood warning committee. We can do a lot of the lifting. We will need some support from Public Works. We're getting to the point we don't like to climb up on buildings and put up rain gauges, but I think we can, little help, we can probably pull this off.
To continue with the theme that Mark brought up, that we analyzed the data, we also went out and visited sites to get a better idea of what's going on. We found that the problems are complex, the analysis needed is complex, and the choices for mitigation are complex. A couple examples I'd like to present here. On this site over in Glenside, along Glenside, the yellow arrows here represent the flow of water through the yards. And it's important to recognize that the water through these yards are coming from 3 or 4 yards down a slope between the backyard, from one backyard to the next backyard, and then concentrating and flowing through one yard. And that yard that's flowing through, this photograph is old, there's a swimming pool in the yard. There's been so much water flowing through that yard, filling the swimming pool with mud, debris so often that the owner finally said, I'm going to get rid of the swimming pool. These are one of the kinds of problems we have. Solution, is it filling up swimming pools with mud or just taking it out? That's the complex mitigation that we have to talk about. The next slide is another example. This is over Hanley at Carlton, I believe it is. Water is running down the street. Carlton is a cul-de-sac now, but about 15, 20 years ago when Hanley was upgraded, Carlton was a through street running into Hanley, made into a cul-de-sac when Hanley was rerouted and improved, and now that cul-de-sac has no drainage at the end of it. Water is running, as the arrows show, through the yards and into the next yard over on Wellington. So again, we have multi-yard problems. I'm leading up to a question, what's public and what's private? And that's something the council is going to have to decide. Very complex problem. While we gave a couple examples here of what we've looked at, remember there are 800 households that we've identified as having some kind of problem. We, as a group of volunteers, can't go walking up and down the creeks as Bob and Eric have done. Can't go to all 800 of the respondents to determine whether the problem is the tree roots in their yard causing their basement backup, which some people would say is a private problem, or whether we have water running down a street because the inlets have been removed, or we have water running through Lewis Park because there's inadequate drainage in the street. So we have this problem. Is it public or private? 800 respondents, a group of volunteers can't handle that. So as you're going to see in our recommendations, you need a professional approach to this, not a group of volunteers. Mitigation is possible. The mitigation can be regrading of the yards. Sometimes that's a public, sometimes that's a private problem. Buy out homes, definitely a public problem. You've already used that alternative. You're eager to use it to help some other residents. Stream bank protection, as Eric talked about, or John talked about, there are people going to their own expense to protect the creek near their house, to protect themselves from water in a 13 square mile watershed, not just water running from their backyard over the edge of their creek. Flash flood early warning system, we've already established that it's a doable thing, something we can do for not much money, but at least can get the police and the fire department out before people have to wade through the water to get out. Some problems are private. Some members of our committee have already done some flood protection in their own home. A lot of you city homes have basement stairwells entering from the outside. When they're in the low-lying areas along River Des Peres, that flood water runs right through that stairwell into their basement. A 6-inch curb may prevent that, but we need an education to help people identify those things. Also, they should discuss that with their insurance agents because there's big ramifications, pros and cons with that kind of self-help. Storm sewer improvements like the Carlton, new inlet, prevent water from running through the yards. City code might reduce some of the water running through yards, especially as people put in new driveways, tear down old houses, put up new houses, changing the drainage pattern. It's not happening as much here as it is in Clayton and Olivet, but it will probably happen more often. We need to get ahead of that. Detention may help in some cases, although in a built-out community like ours, it has less value in our community, but we can't ignore it. It's very beneficial. Many people came to us or we were made aware they have concerns about the rising price of flood insurance. Right now, flood insurance is heavily subsidized by Congress. That subsidy is being decreased every 5 years or so. This community, could enter into a community rating system that might reduce some of that insurance cost. And then the stream maintenance, as Eric talked about, there is some clogging in the under some of the culverts. Some of those culverts are owned by MoDOT, some by St. Louis County, some by University City. Who maintains those? Who's responsible? There's some politics involved in that. Your bailiwick. I've already straddled into some of the public-private mitigation, but here's some other things. Small-scale yard regrading. Some people would benefit from that. It's not their neighbors, it's themselves. They've got their downspout draining onto their yard. But maybe some re-education, redirection of the roof drains, removal of root obstructions from their own sanitary laterals, flood-proofing structures we've talked about, and elevation certificates, that is proving that your house is not really below the flood, the base flood elevation, may benefit someone in terms of their insurance. On the other hand, on public education, some people may be mapped outside of the floodplain, but they ought to have flood insurance because they still have problems, no matter what the mapping says. How does University City compare to other communities? We looked at Ladue, Town and Country, and St. Peter's because it kind of straddles our situation. And they are also doing something about their stormwater. Ladue is much smaller than we are. Town and Country is smaller than we are, only 9,000 or 10,000 people. St. Peter's is a little bit bigger than we are. Well, more than a little bit bigger than we are. Ladue is spending about $13,000 per square mile. Town and Country is spending only $700,000 per square mile, rather. And St. Peter's, almost $6 million per square mile. Where should we fall? That's something that you guys have to decide and be faced with. We have estimated, from looking at the Corps of Engineers report, that there's $20 million already estimated for the buyouts. We think, by extrapolating the data we've looked at from Ladue, Town and Country, St. Peter's, that there's probably another $20 million worth of public expense in University City. This is just extrapolating what we've seen from other communities. For our conclusions, the types of complaints, the types of problems we have we've categorized them in 6 categories. Stormwater between the yards, basement flooding, flooding from the creeks, erosion of the creek banks, poor stormwater collection in streets, and expensive flood insurance. 800 or 900 complaints have been identified, but the analysis, complete analysis of these problems cannot be completed by a citizen task force or group of volunteers. It's going to take professional engineers either on your staff devoted to that or hiring a consultant to do that. What that professional staff or consultant would do would be to identify or consolidate the 800 to 900 problems into projects. Some of those multiple hundreds of identified complaints and problems will really resolve into much smaller number of projects. There may have been 3 or 4 people on Carlton that complained about water running through their yards, but it's really only one project, putting new inlets in at the end of Carlton. So we'll find that in lots of places with the right evaluation. And then we go to the next step. Which of those projects should be done first? What is your prioritization? What can you do? What can the community do to tackle the first or the most important problems? Near-term recommendations, what we can handle right now. The flash flood warning system, $10,000, $20,000, we can at least notify the police department where they've got to be, and that this flood, this rainstorm, is different than the other ones. A library of self-help measures, continuing to collect and update the file of complaints regarding stormwater, not just floods, but stormwater. Participate in FEMA's community rating system, and re-examining the ordinances to see which needs to be beefed up so that when people infill, we're not causing problems to the neighbors. A question that we have is, should this task force continue? Is there a role for them? Longer-term solutions, there we go. Long-term recommendations would be to engage the consulting engineer or assign a dedicated public service engineer to going through the massive data that we've identified to consolidate the complaints into mitigation projects and then prioritize those projects. Funding, reestablish MSD's OMCI tax. There was a presentation here a few months ago by the MSD people on what your position would be on that. I haven't heard that it's going forward, but maybe good word from you guys to MSD might hurry that process along. It's not big money, but it's more money than we have now. We recommend that you continue to pursue the buyouts with Congress's help, with the Corps of Engineers' help. Pursue FEMA grants. I think you've gotten FEMA in the past. Continue to pursue those. Arrange for from the culverts, River de Pere and Ingleholm Creek culverts, and determine your responsibility for funding. Is there funding within the city here? And questions?
Our last speaker, by the way, was Gary Ehrenberg.
Not so much a question, but I'd like to give a kind of a hats off to Councilmember Cusick. When he was elected, he could have chosen to step down and assume a different role, but he has continued to serve and is very committed to the work here, and even possibly continuation of this.
Well, thank you for those kudos, and yes, I would like to, since we all know that Councilmember Carr's last council meeting will probably be April 27th, I would like to see the work of this task force continue, and I will make sure that this stays evermost in our minds and pursuing what we can to look at some of the recommendations and see what we can do to carry those out, whether it would be the continuation of this task force or if it would turn into a board or a commission. And I believe that Councilmember Carr and I were wanting to sit down with the city manager at some point and discuss what some future events might be or how this might develop in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the report and the level of work and detail that clearly went into it. I have a really specific question. The Carlton cutoff there at Hanley Road is rather interesting. Has anybody looked into how that came about and who paid for what? And being that Hanley's a county road, did they engineer that and build that?
That's a good question. I've lived in New City for about 67 years now, and I remember when Hanley was rerouted. John, you too. I suspect that the engineering documents from 20 years ago, 25 years ago when that was rerouted, probably just missed the degree of water running down that street. And who the responsibility is, I think that's pretty muddied by now. I actually work in this business. This is actually my vocation, profession. In Ladue, Ladue would be reluctant to take responsibility for fixing the Carrollton drainage problem. Ladue is one of our clients. Town and Country is another client, and they take a really different view. They will do it. They have more money than Ladue and U City. I know we think Ladue has a lot of money, but it's, so each community takes a different position. St. Peter's is a really different situation because everything in St. Peter's, except for their drinking water, is St. Peter's. So in that case, St. Peter's would take responsibility for that. It becomes a political question, what you want to do. Theoretically, the Carrollton adding a inlet there will be an MSD fix or a St. Louis County Highway Department fix. But if you had the money, you could accomplish it quicker yourself than to rely on St. Louis County or MSD.
The monies that are listed for Ladue, Town and Country, and St. Peter's, I assume that's a total amount, and that's their municipal, or is that what in conjunction with?
No, that's their money.
So Ladue has set aside or will set aside $114 million.
I think it's over about 10 years. It's not every year that they get that. Both Ladue and Town and Country have a sales tax, a park stormwater sales tax. Neither one of those communities had allocated those funds early, so they were split between storm and parks. As I understand it, in University City, most of that park stormwater money is already allocated to parks and bonds. So that kind of thing is a very community-specific issue.
Anyone else? you folks did an incredible job. What a very professional presentation with the right amount of detail and a little bit of 10,000 foot level as well. So thank you very much for your dedication, putting in the time to do this. And you know, your question of whether you stay or not is probably much more about you folks and your dedication than it is us, in that seldom have I think we've seen a presentation that probably has risen to the level of this presentation with the depth of knowledge on this problem. So I know my colleagues join me in saying thank you very much for the work you've done. Thank you. With that, unless someone has anything else, we will have about 15 minutes before we start the public session. And I know you guys want to stay for the whole thing.